If an exposure does occur, immediately stop and wash your hands with soap and water. Flush mucous membranes. Report the incident to your supervisor immediately. Failure to report an incident may limit your ability to prove exposure or obtain appropriate medical treatment. Attempt to identify the source individual and collect any contaminated materials for testing purposes. Seek medical attention. If you have not had an HPV vaccine, it can be administered after an exposure. Employers should follow all federal and state requirements for recording and reporting occupational injuries and exposures. The employer is responsible for ensuring the confidentiality of your medical records. Your records cannot be disclosed without your written consent. The Exposure Control Plan is a guideline for employees that have had exposure to blood or OPIM and is required for each work area that has a potential exposure to blood or OPIM. Your exposure control plan must be specific to your department, reviewed yearly, accessible to all employees. Non-managerial employees shall have input on the exposure control plan. The information should be recorded in the exposed person's confidential medical record made available to qualified healthcare professionals and contain the following information: date and time of the exposure incident, location of the exposure incident, job classification of the employee exposed to BBP, identification and documentation of the source individual unless the identification is not feasible, the route and circumstances of exposure, details of the exposure including the type and amount of fluid or material and the severity of the exposure. Identify procedural changes that would prevent reoccurrence of any conditions that increase the risk of exposure. Document what engineer controls, work practice controls, and PPE that was used. If you are working in an area where there is reasonable likelihood of exposure, do not eat, drink, smoke, apply cosmetics or lip balm, handle contact lenses. Do not keep food or drink in refrigerators, freezers, shelves, cabinets, or on countertops where blood or potentially infectious materials are present.